This video is brought to you by Squarespace. From websites and online stores to tools and analytics, Squarespace is the all-in-one platform to build a beautiful presence and run your business. Little tutorial today on composition. This is not just any tutorial. This is an exercise that I was taught years ago that was probably one of the most valuable tutorials that I've ever learned in terms of visual composition. We're going to put down the camera today, and I know some of you are going to complain. You're like, this has nothing to do with photography. But it does. So quick background here. I personally don't have any formal training in photography, believe it or not. I have a degree. It's in music, which is similar, and I bring a lot of that stuff over to the visual side. But there was a point, when this was probably around 2099, somewhere in there, where I did want to have some formal training. So I actually went back to college. I did not get a second degree, but I just took a couple classes. And it's funny how easy college is when you don't have to be there and you're just doing a couple classes, but I digress. So I took a graphic design course, and one thing that was really important to me is that I wanted to take a course that was just graphic design. I didn't want to take things that dealt with Adobe Illustrator. And at that time, a lot of college programs were starting to just go over to computers, and they were teaching you how to use software. I didn't want to learn how to use the software. I just wanted to understand visual elements. And I took this awesome class, credit where it is due. Lori Collins was my teacher. She taught this very exercise. It's something that is stuck with me to this day, and I think it's one of the most valuable things. So a couple things you're going to need to get started here. First of all, no camera. We're going to get to that later in this video of how this relates to photography, so you're going to have to trust me right now. You're going to need some paper and some scissors, and that's about it. I had some sketchbooks stuff laying around, so if you want to get nice paper, that's fine. You can use whatever, but it is important that you use white paper. We're going to cut that up, and you're going to need a darker sheet of paper. I've got some black construction paper here. And so what we're doing is we are going to work with what we call figure-ground relationships. Figure-ground relationships. What does that mean? What is a figure? What is a ground? Well, let's start with the ground. This is the ground. This is like, think of this as your sensor on your camera. It's a blank canvas. There's nothing on it. And so what we're going to do is we are going to put things on it, and we're going to experiment around with what those relationships and what those possibilities are. Figure is a little bit different. So what I did is I took my white sheet of paper and I cut it up. I used my scissors. I just cut this, and I cut some arbitrary shapes. But what you're going to do is actually start with 3 small circles, really small circles. I just used a dime and I traced them and then I cut them out. I did other shapes as well, some larger circles. I even just did some random strange cutouts. And so what we're going to do, it doesn't matter exactly what it is, start with the 3 small circles, but what we're going to do, we're going to experiment with how these relate onto our ground. Now the ground is actually interesting because in photography, this could represent your sensor on your camera. Now in post-production, you can crop, you could get a square, something like that. But in general, you want to think about those dimensions of your ground. Now your ground could be landscape orientation like this. You can also go portrait orientation like this. There's a big difference between the two. This tends to be more cinematic. This tends to be more portrait-like, but it is up to you. Experiment both ways. Back in the day when I did this for this course I was taking, I had to arrange shapes in various configurations, and I had to do like 20 of these. Everything had to be glued down, and I had to turn in all those variations. There's easier ways that you can do this, and I'll talk about those in a second. Now, I'm serious. You guys really should do this exercise. I know most of you won't. You're watching a YouTube video, you'll get interested in this for a while, and then you'll click on something else, and you'll forget all about it. But I hope you remember it later, and you refer back to this, and you actually try this, because I'm serious. This is the one compositional exercise that to this day I think of every time I pick up a camera, and I'm actually bringing this back out and doing it for you guys in this video. So let's get started. So we're going to begin with the 3 small circles that I have cut out, and the idea here once again is we're going to compose using our figures. We've got 3 of them, and their relationship to one another and their relationship to the ground, which is the black paper that they're sitting on. So we're making a picture essentially. So the first thing that you might start doing is moving these around and saying, wait a minute, you know, what makes sense is to do something like this, where we have something that is very symmetrical, it's very tight, it's very clean. We have 1 in the middle, 2 on the side, and we have this tidy little composition. Now, there's nothing wrong with symmetry. Symmetry is awesome, and it is a fundamental of composition. It's only one way of doing it, though. And in my exercise, I had to do 20 of these, so you're going to exhaust that pretty quickly. So what can we do to start making this more interesting and taking it out of this symmetrical function? Well, one thing you can do is just disrupt it, and I can take something and bring it close to the edge. This may not be the most elegant compositional solution, but what I've done is I've created disruption. Intentionally, but I've created disruption, and we've done this in 2 ways. First of all, I disrupted our symmetry in the middle. Secondly, I brought this piece and just arbitrarily took it to the edge of the composition. Now, one of the most important things that I learned years ago doing this very assignment is that things that are near the edge tend to have more emphasis and more weight than things towards the middle. The middle is the place where everything wants to be happy. It wants to live. That's where you expect to see things in a picture. And when you have things close to the edge, that creates a little bit of dissonance, a little bit of disruption. And so you can use this to a really interesting effect. Let me give you an example. So for instance, if I take these 3 dots and I bring them all next to each other like this, and I put them close to the edge, that's a little more interesting compositional element. They start to act more as a shape. This is something that you see in graphic interfaces. So for instance, when you're on a website, it looks like something you can click and drag. As far as the window goes, you might see this on your phone. That's a very powerful compositional element. It put these close to the edge. It brings emphasis. It leaves a great deal of space in the middle, and also treats them as a group. There's many ways that you can move these around. If I treat them like this, all of a sudden you're starting to start seeing this symmetry. These objects start to create line, and you can create line in a bunch of different ways. If I do it, let's get off axis and do it out of symmetry here, but as long as they're straight, they start to imply a line. If I take one of these and I bring it outside a little bit, then we start to imply shape. You start to see triangles, and I can move these around. As long as there's 3 pieces, that's always pretty much going to be a triangle, no matter which way you slice it, and they're going to start behaving like that when they act as a small group like that. You can bring them further apart. You might disrupt the shape a little bit, but I don't know, I still see the shape. Now, the reality is that this is a very simple exercise in composition. So in real life or in photography, you're probably not going to have every little thing being the same size. You might if you're shooting something like flowers or something that's more of an object, but when you get into people and street photography and all kinds of other things, then it gets more complex. So what we can do is we can start introducing more complex shapes onto our figure ground study here. What if I put a square in here? Well, the square can sit diagonally like that. I can also straighten it out, and it can act more like a square. What does this start to look like? I mean, you start to imply things at this point, like maybe a face. There's all kinds of ways you can interpret this. And again, you see line, but it's a little more interesting now because we've created a little bit of a disruption with the shape at least. And this doesn't work as much when it doesn't line up correctly. So there's going to be a lot of using your eye to kind of try to visualize this. Another thing you can do is mess with scale. So let's remove the square for a minute. Let's use a bigger circle. And believe it or not, this was supposed to be larger, but it's not much larger. Like that was a dime. This was a nickel that I traced. This was a Gatorade bottle. Anyway, if you go around, I can start to create depth this way, because we're starting to create 3 dimensions in a 2-dimensional space, which could be very interesting. If you put that close to the edge, it has a completely different emphasis to it. Depends on where it is on the page or on the ground. So these are different ways you can interpret the same thing. Now, what happens if I start getting chaotic with this and I put a lot of different shapes down here? Let's just put everything down and let's see what happens, because this might be something that happens in photography where you come upon a scene, and believe me, a lot of people will shoot like this, where they just take a picture of whatever's in front of them. They don't actually move their angle or their vantage point or anything like that. But anyway, when you start to see this, well, at first it's chaos, but what if I start to arrange these? So maybe these 3 guys sit over here, this comes over here, these spin off a bit. I don't know, there's different ways you could interpret something like that. Maybe these come and sit over here. Maybe something hangs off the edge, it gets cropped. Now I'm starting to see this composition in different elements. So here's a shape here, or here's a group that works together. Here's a group that works together down here, and here's one over here. So I have 3 elements here. So again, what I'm doing at this point is I'm taking the chaos, and my first inclination is to try to simplify the chaos, because it's easy to work with those first 3 little circles that we had. So I want to kind of try to get back to that. So one thing you can do is try to bring back some of that minimalism and try to treat things as groups. Now, there's a huge difference in what we're doing here and what we actually do when we're taking pictures, because this is actually known as an additive process. Photography is subtractive. You need to understand that difference if this is going to apply to what you're doing at photography at all. And I want to get into that in just a second, but real quick, I want to give a shout out to our sponsor today, who are the awesome folks over at Squarespace. Squarespace is the easiest way to build a website, photo gallery, or online store without having to write a single line of code. Start with one of their gorgeous templates, use their drag and drop interface, build your brand online. But Squarespace is way more than just a way to build a website. Squarespace provides an amazing set of tools to create revenue and run a business. Squarespace now features dedicated member areas, allowing you to connect with your audience and generate revenue through members-only content. You can manage members, you can send them email communications, and you can leverage audience insights. Building an e-commerce site couldn't be any easier, and Squarespace now also supports collecting donations, so you can get support for a cause or charity by gathering contributions with PayPal, Apple Pay, Stripe, and Venmo, and build your audience using social sharing. The Squarespace blogging platform has a sharing button that you can customize that's going to allow sharing on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, StumbleUpon, Reddit, Pinterest, and Tumblr. So head over to Squarespace for a free trial. Once you feel that Squarespace is right for you, I can save you an additional 10% on your first order by using offer code AOP on checkout, or just use the link below this video. Once again, that offer code is AOP, and I want to give a special shout out and thanks to the awesome folks at Squarespace for sponsoring this video. I hope that some of you actually go through and do this exercise. This whole process of working with very simplified shapes on a very simplified background is very powerful because you start to understand relationships to things, and you also start to understand that with composition, everything has to be in the picture for a reason. Things that are in the picture have to have a relationship to one another. That's how you have strong composition in the end. And so when I had to do this, I don't remember how many there were, but it was a graphic design course, but there was, I think I had to turn 20 of these in. They all had to be done on the paper. They all had to be glued into place. Everything was intentional, and I had to turn all this stuff in. There's an easier way to do it, and you could just do it like we're doing it here. Use your phone, and when you have something, take a picture of it, take 20 images, and then you can refer back to those later, and then go do it again. Do it with different size objects. Do it with different shapes. Cut new ones. This is something that's really important, and it starts to train your eye to see things and start to make certain connections and certain relationships. Now, relationships, the figures with one another, and also their relationship to the ground. So there's two relationships that are really important. So what is the next step? Well, we want to talk about how this relates to photography. Now, one thing I want to say, it's really important, that makes this very different, is that when you consider all the visual arts, most of them are some kind of additive process. So for instance, with painting, with any kind of graphic design, you start with a blank canvas and you're going to start adding things to it. And photography doesn't work like that. Photography is what we refer to as a subtractive process. In other words, through the camera, you're taking a picture of something that's kind of already there. I guess you could make the argument that maybe some types of studio photography is going to be more additive, especially a still life or a portrait session where you can control the lighting and you can move things around. But I would even argue, I mean, you didn't draw the person you're taking a portrait of. They showed up. God made them, and it's your responsibility as a photographer to understand how to draw out their most interesting characteristics, hopefully some of their personality. And a lot of that starts coming back to composition and starting to look for shape and starting to look for relationships and things. And that's where this exercise comes in very handy. But I would also recommend looking at photographers' work. This is something I've been preaching for 13 years now. I can give you a few recommendations of places I would start. I think Henri Cortège is one of the great photographers who was incredible at this, at understanding a very simplified approach to composition. He was very consistent, very prolific. He had a very long career, and he was really just pretty incredible. And so, of course, most of these are in black and white, so that layer of color is removed, so it is simplified a step there. But look at the relationships between objects in these images. Look at how they relate to the ground. Is this vertical? Is it landscape? What's in the image? What is the scale? How do these things relate to each other? And everything is always just very deliberately placed. And I think this is what separates really incredible photographers from people that are just kind of okay. You know, if you just lift up the camera, something is interesting to you, and you lift it to your eye and take the picture, that's fine. But I think when you look at people like Cortège or even Henri Cartier-Bresson, who I mention a lot these days, these are photographers that are just incredible with composition. And I think it's like understanding where your subject is, where things are in the room. Can I move my vantage point? Can I move my angle? What are things going to do? How do I time that out? And Bresson always referred to this as the decisive moment, and he compared it to being a hunter, where you're waiting for your prey with a rifle, and you're going to pick the exact moment. You're trying to anticipate what's going to happen and what people are going to do, and he was really successful at this. So Henri Cartier-Bresson is another individual I would look at, and a lot of times, you know, I'm not going to get into it here, but you'll see people break his work down, and you look for leading lines, you look for shapes, you look for triangles, you look for dynamic symmetry, and all these compositional techniques that he would employ into his work. But really it comes down to these figure ground relationships once again. Yes, there's more advanced things that we can put on top of this, but that's a great starting point, is look at this work, understand it, figure out what's interesting about those compositions and what makes things harmonious, what makes them work together. And I think this is something that's going to take your own work up to the next level. So we're going to explore more of this. I've got some creativity stuff that we're going to be talking about, but I had to get this out of the way first because this is a really important lesson in composition. And like I said, I did this years ago, and it's something that I still think about all the time today. So anyway, if you have any comments or questions, drop them below. I'll see you guys in the next video. Until then, later.